everybody in Luqman Nation, this is Jacqueline Luqman, and off to the side here is
Abdushahi Luqman.
And welcome to another what we think is going to be a really great edition of Live in Luqman Nation, Live in Coffee, Current Events, and Politics in Luqman Nation.
The most dangerous show on social media.
So we've been wanting to have this conversation for a long time because there has been so much going on in the world in regard to the expansion and the explosion of American militarism. And we've recently gotten involved personally in a more active role in the anti-imperialist, anti-war, peace-focused movement here in the United States. And we're learning a lot of new stuff ourselves. But we've been really privileged, you all, to have made great relationships and learned a lot of stuff from some really wise people who have taught us an immense amount of knowledge about things that we might have understood before, but we've certainly got a better clue of now. And as you can see on our screen, that one of those people is Ajamu Baraka. If you call yourself a so-called progressive, and that's a whole nother discussion. We've had discussions about that. But you ought to know who Ajamu Baraka is. But aside from being the vice presidential candidate for the Green Party in the 2016 election, Ajamu Baraka has a more than 20-year history of human rights, advocacy, Pan-Africanism focus, advocacy for the liberation of black people, not just in the United States, but around the world, and anti-imperialist and anti-war and peace-focused advocacy. So, with no further ado, ladies and gentlemen in Luqman Nation, please welcome Ajamu Baraka.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. It's really a pleasure to be with you. Been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time.
I know we keep threatening to get you on the show, but we keep missing each other. So we're really thankful that you were able to take some time out with us tonight. And this is what we wanted to talk about tonight is such a big subject, and we feel like this is just going to be one of lots of conversations and ongoing conversation, not just with you, but with a lot of other people who are involved in the anti-imperialist, anti-war, and peace-focused global and domestic effort. But the first thing I would really like for you to do is to tell people what the organization you created and spearhead is now, post 2016 elections.
Well, a small group of us came together and decided in early 2017 that this was the moment for us to begin to revive a very important tradition among black folks, African people, and that is our traditional stance against war and militarism. We know that that traditional stance has been or had been somewhat undermined as a consequence of a shift to the right among black opinion and black political thought as a consequence of our first black president that helped to shift black politics to the right. But we know that kind of shifting was taking place somewhat even before Barack Obama.
Right.
Part of the consequence of the counterinsurgency against the Black Liberation Movement that really intensified in the 1970s was that there was an ideological component to that counterinsurgency, and that component was to basically attempt to ensure that another revolutionary generation that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s would not emerge again. So part of that was to construct a quote-unquote American consciousness, if you will, And the consequence has been that basically over the course of the last few decades, there's been a decided shift to the right within black intellectual discourse and general sort of worldviews. So we thought that in 2017 we had an opportunity because now people were thinking again critically, we saw, to revive this anti-war position among our people. So we launched the Black Alliance for Peace on April the 4th, 2017. And we did that because we believed that that was a very important day, because on that day it was 50 years to the day that Dr. King came out in opposition to the Vietnam War. That very famous speech at Riverside Church in New York, where he broke his silence on Vietnam. So we thought that 50 years later, that was the appropriate date for us to relaunch the Black Alliance for Peace. The Black Alliance for Peace, it has a tagline: we are a people-centered human rights project against war, repression, and imperialism. So we began to build this alliance in 2017. We now have been in place for about a year and a half. The main objective was to organize independent, black, anti-war, pro-peace, anti-imperialist formation in this country as part, though, of a larger project, which was to assist in rebuilding, reviving, if you will, the broader anti-war movement here in this country. And so for the year and a half we've been in place, we have made significant progress. We have been able to expand and build this alliance. We've been able to assist in reviving the anti-war movement here in this country. And we've been part of some pretty interesting new initiatives. One being our campaign on AFRICOM, which is part of a broader campaign that we helped to spearhead when we came together and launched the coalition to close all U.S. foreign bases in January of this year. So this AFRICOM campaign we'll talk about in a moment is part of that broader campaign to basically put some focus, some attention on the reality of the fact that the U.S. has between 800 and 1,000 bases across the planet, and to engage the people in a conversation around what that means in terms of the U.S. and its ability to project power, but also to intervene into the affairs of other nations. And is there a connection between the activities of AFRICOM on the continent and the increasing militarization, militarism that we see with police forces and other agencies domestically?
And that's a lot for people who are not usually focused on international issues to digest. So let's just focus on the AFRICOM piece, because this is something that people aren't even aware of, I don't think. And most Americans especially didn't know anything about a military presence on the continent of Africa until last year, when the young black soldier was killed in an operation that nobody knew was going on in Niger. And all of a sudden people are asking, we have troops in Niger? So what is AFRICOM for people who don't know what it is?
Yeah, the African Command, the U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM, is part of the U.S. command structure. Basically what they have done is that they have mapped out and divided up the planet. And for every part of the world, there is a U.S. command. Because we've got to keep in mind that when we talk about the U.S., we're talking about a global power, basically an empire that has global reach. And so part of what the objective of these command structures are is to be able to project U.S. military power in every part of the planet. So under the Bush administration, they decided they were going to formalize their military relationships with various African nations into a more formalized African command. That command was put in place October the 1st, 2008. So we celebrated just a few days ago the 10th anniversary of AFRICOM. The intention or the intended purpose of AFRICOM was supposed to be, and is always framed in these sort of benevolent kinds of terms, that this is a command put in place to assist African nations in dealing with their security issues and to be able to protect and advance U.S. national interests also. It was framed as a necessary command to deal with the growing threat of so-called terrorism on the African continent. What we have seen as a consequence of this command is a significant expansion of the military footprint on the African continent by the U.S. A 1,900% increase in military presence on the African continent. It's important to say real quick, many of us thought that once Barack Obama came into office, because this is October 1st, 2008.
Right.
He was elected. We thought that when he came into office that next year, in January, that we could maybe persuade him to recognize the potential danger of having a more formalized military structure that would allow for the U.S. military to be to more effectively penetrate into various African nations. Understanding that when you have these kind of activities, what almost always follows is a degree of destabilization. But of course, Barack Obama was in support of the African Command, and we saw this dramatic expansion of the command on the African continent.
So let me go back. I'm still kind of stuck on the 1,000% increase in military presence on the continent. What does that mean?
It means that going from a few hundred troops in the past and limited military to military relationships between the U.S. and various African states, that means that today there is a military to military relationship with 53 of the 54 African states. It means that there are literally dozens of bases on the African continent and dozens more where the U.S. has access to various bases in different countries. And the way they try to reduce the number of bases on the African continent, they perpetuate the fiction that they don't have bases because these bases are technically still owned by the host government. But these base agreements that they have with these various states say that in essence the U.S. has complete and total access to these bases, and those bases become under the control of the U.S. government. In a number of cases, those host country cannot even go up on the territory in their own on those bases once the U.S. ceases control. So basically, they have bases, but they want to call it something else. So we have that reality, and we have the fact that there are actual military combat operations. Nick Turse documented that there was something like 600 of those kinds of operations just a year and a half ago on the African continent. So that's what we mean by the dramatic increase in the military presence on the African continent.
Now, I've gotten some information from people who have served in AFRICOM and under the African Command in its early stages, and heard from some people who have recently served, and they cite the humanitarian efforts, the HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment clinics, the microloans that are handled not by the Department of Defense, but by the Department of the Treasury, I think, because the U.S. AFRICOM is not just the U.S. military. It's not just the Department of Defense. It's also made up of several so-called civilian federal U.S. federal agencies, right? Like USAID, USAID, the Department of Treasury, the FBI. We all understand that the FBI is, it they've got serious problems. But other federal civilian, quote unquote, civilian agencies. So what is there any good that AFRICOM has done? And what do you say to the people who when you talk about AFRICOM and the challenges that it's creating for the African people? What do you have to say to people who say, well, what about the good that AFRICOM has done?
Well, we say, one, that if you believe in African sovereignty, then you understand that anytime you have foreign troops in a particular nation, there is no real sovereignty. One. Secondly, we say that part of the public relations objectives is to frame this penetration of these countries and the reduction of their sovereignty in these benevolent kinds of arguments. But basically, these is there to help these nations to engage in all these humanitarian kinds of operations. Thirdly, we find that the closest relationships that are formed with these various countries are relationships in which the military is helping to prop up governments that have lost legitimacy among the people of that state. Mm-hmm. So they are there to provide security for their allies. And what that means is that they are engaged in activities directly sometimes, mainly indirectly, through training and providing equipment and logistical support to some very repressive governments on the African continent. So we say that whatever humanitarian positive consequence one can point to, we can point to 10 other negative consequences of having this military presence on the African continent. We say, look, if the U.S. is so concerned about providing humanitarian assistance, developmental assistance to African countries, then why not follow the model of, say, for example, the Chinese? We know that there's controversy around the Chinese and their role on the African continent, but no one can dispute the fact that the Chinese have engaged in significant investments in terms of infrastructural investments for roads, ports, railways. But the U.S. and the Western nations, they don't provide that kind of support. They only provide enough support that will facilitate their efforts to extract resources from the African continent. If there's any development, the development is truncated, very narrow. It's like from, the uranium mine straight to the railway, straight to the port and back to Europe.
Right. Right.
So we don't buy that. We know that basically those humanitarian kinds of programs are programs that are put in place to provide political and ideological cover for what we see as a military colonization project of the U.S. state.
And let's be clear, when you talk about the extraction of resources from Africa, I think our viewers need to understand that Africa maintains its status in the world as the continent, the only continent that has on a low end 40% of every resource the rest of the world needs. I mean, everything from, France, just to give people an understanding of the scale of the importance of Africa to the rest of the world, France still gets like 40 to 50% of its uranium for its nuclear power plants that power much of the country from Africa.
75%.
Oh, I'm sorry. 75%. My producer over here corrected me. 75%. France. See, that's why he's great at that. France. That's what it is. France actually gets. Thank you. France actually gets 75% of the uranium it needs to power its nuclear power plants, to keep the lights on in France from Africa. You know, so we're not talking about an inconsequential patch of land here that the United States is just looking at and is willing to cede to another world superpower like China that is willing to spend the money to actually provide resources that the African people can use, even as we question China's motives for doing that.
Exactly. Look, the fact of the matter is that basically, whatever, I hate to frame it like this, but Africa has always played a role in the larger imperialist system, and whatever powers outside of the African people themselves, whatever powers control Africa usually control the world.
Wow.
We should remind ourselves and remind your listeners that, in the run-up to the first imperialist war, what we refer to as the World War I, in an attempt to try to mitigate the tensions between the various European empires, they were in intense competition among themselves. They were carving up the African continent, but they were in conflict. So what happened was there was a conference in Berlin in 1885, in which the European powers came together and basically had a quote-unquote gentleman's agreement to carve up the African continent, have everybody to respect the various claims, and to dissipate the conflict. Now, here we are now, 100-something years later. We're in another period where you have this intense competition among these various capitalist blocs. And again, Africa is at the center of this struggle. So the decisions by the U.S. policymakers to have this Africa Command had those geopolitical objectives in mind. That basically, they were not going to allow the Chinese to be able to gain disproportionate influence on the African continent, for the very fact that just what you raised, so many of the planet's precious resources are located in Africa. There's a reason why you have a conflict in the Democratic Republic of the Congo over the last 2 decades that have resulted in 6 million people losing their lives, because you have this fight over precious resources like cobalt, coltan, copper. These are things that are absolutely necessary for the industrial processes in the West. And so you have these conflicts on the African continent, oil, gas, and instead of, normal kind of capitalist relationships, what you have instead are these predatory approaches by the U.S., by the French, and other nations. So the U.S. is playing the card it has at hand, which is the military card, in order to make sure that it has the ability to try to control and influence events on the African continent.
I think we got a question over here.
Yeah, one question.
Yes.
Is from Gwendolyn Barrington. And she asks, she said, how is the American economy propped up by sending citizens to Africa? The AFRICOM expansion was caused by the recession. Would you like to address that?
Well, the African cause or the objectives of AFRICOM wasn't just as a consequence of the recession, but if I understood the question she was raising, but as a consequence of longer-term geostrategic objectives. And the main objective of the U.S. policymakers is to do what? To maintain their global control, their global dominance. So controlling Africa is key. So they're not concerned about providing jobs or whatever to people in the U.S. They are concerned about Africa's precious resources, its oil, its gas, and other precious metals, to prop up their system and to help them to maintain their control of the global economy.
So I'm glad that Gwendolyn asked that question. I hope that answers your question, Gwendolyn. But I'm glad she asked that question about the American economy, because we've been having conversations, and this is our last question, and then unfortunately we are out of time, and that just makes me mad, because I know every great conversation just goes by like that. But we've been having conversations with people who are very concerned about the economic plight of black people in America, which we have to get reparations, and that's just the beginning and the end of that. But we're finding that there's a growing body of black people who are focused on reparations or some economic reparative justice for black people in the United States, that are focused on black people being the descendants of slaves, and they have this idea that Pan-Africanism is dead. That Pan-Africanism and the concerns of Africa are not connected to the struggle of black people in our pursuit of economic justice in this country.
You're right. I guess, to phrase it, like, to view Pan-Africanism as an illegitimate alternative to what Brother Ajamu Baraka said about the geopolitical strains that we're used to, that's been forced upon us.
Right.
And that when we come up with Pan-Africanism as an alternative for our own self-determination, somehow that's looked at as being either illegitimate or not effective. And this is just not by only white people. I mean, you have leading black voices that are starting to say that Pan-Africanism has no role in the 21st century.
Right. So Ajamu, in light of what is going on in Africa now with AFRICOM, what does that have to do with this struggle? What does AFRICOM have to do with black people in America? Why should we be concerned about it? And what does that have to do with the larger struggle for black determination, not just in Africa, but here in the United States? You got the last 4 minutes to deal with that one.
Malcolm said back in the 1960s, before he was assassinated, that one could not understand Mississippi unless you understood the Congo, and you couldn't understand the Congo unless you understood Mississippi. And so the sentiment there was basically, we need to understand that we are up against a global system, that we can't just have an understanding that the plight that we face in the U.S. is unique to the conditions of the U.S. We need to understand that this plight is connected to a global structure of oppression, and that the plight of black people on the continent is just a flip side of the plight of black people in the U.S. We are up against the same repressive state apparatus. We are exploited by the same economic relationships. Now, they have a specific kind of expression in the U.S. as opposed to Africa, but it's the same world system. So the $268 million being spent to prop up AFRICOM are resources that could be used to address some of the needs we have in the U.S. The fact that the U.S. is transferring military-grade equipment from the federal government to the military down to police forces to repress us is the flip side of what they're doing in Africa. We talked earlier about the fact that you had a 1,900% expansion of the military presence on the continent. Well, during that same period, there was a 2,400% increase in the value of military equipment transferred from the federal government to police forces across the country, with the primary aim being to control us. So we've got, part of what we're doing with this campaign is we've got to bring back an internationalist understanding among our people, an internationalist consciousness. But basically, we up against one common enemy. We got a billion Africans on the continent. We got 150 million Africans